The Arizona sun beat down on redemption with a merciless, white-hot fury, baking the dust of the main street into a fine, choking powder. For Ethan Cole, the heat was just another layer of the pressure crushing him. Every creak of his worn leather boots on the boardwalk was a reminder of the ranch his father had built, a legacy that was slipping through his fingers like dry soil. The past 2 years had been brutal, a drought that bled the land dry, followed by a cattle sickness that had decimated his herd. Now, all that stood between him and ruin was the cold, calculating heart of Silas Blackwood, the town's banker. A boy no older than 12 scurried up to him, holding out a crisp envelope. "Mr. Cole, Mr. Blackwood requests your presence at the bank." Ethan's stomach clenched. A summons was never good news. He nodded grimly, tossing the boy a nickel he couldn't afford to spare. The bank stood at the end of the street, a formidable brick structure that seemed to sneer at the weathered wooden storefronts around it. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of polished mahogany and old money. Blackwood sat behind a massive desk, his face a mask of detached appraisal. He was a man built of sharp angles and quiet menace, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the sweat-stained shirts of the men whose lives he controlled. "Mr. Cole," Blackwood began, his voice smooth as river stone. "Please sit." He didn't wait for an answer, instead sliding a stack of papers across the desk. "As you know, your loan is 3 months past due. The grace period, which I extended out of respect for your late father, expires at sundown tomorrow." Ethan's hands balled into fists in his lap. "I just need more time, Mr. Blackwood. The rains are coming. I can rebuild the herd." "Hope is not a currency I trade in," Blackwood said flatly. "The foreclosure is proceeding. The Cole Ranch will be auctioned off on the 1st of the month." The words hung in the air, a death sentence for his family's dream. Desperation clawed at Ethan's throat. "Isn't there anything I can do?" Blackwood steepled his fingers, his gaze unblinking. "As a matter of fact, there is. I have a proposition for you, a private matter." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "I have a niece, Alara, my late sister's only child. She is of marrying age and needs a husband to provide her with a respectable home. You are a man of good stock, despite your current financial misfortune." Ethan stared, bewildered. "You want me to marry your niece? In exchange for your hand in marriage," Blackwood continued, as if discussing a livestock sale, "I will consider your entire debt paid in full. The deed to the Cole Ranch will be yours, free and clear." The offer was ludicrous. A trap. There had to be a catch. Then, Ethan remembered the whispers. Alara. A quiet, ghostly figure he sometimes saw in town, always alone. He recalled the pitying glances from the other women, the cruel, hushed remarks he'd overheard outside the general store. Poor thing, cursed womb, barren as the desert itself. They said a fever had stolen her ability to have children years ago. In a town where a woman's worth was measured by the sons she could provide, Alara was an object of tragic scorn. Blackwood was offering him a life, but a life shackled to a woman the town saw as broken. A wife who could never give him a family, the one thing he'd always wanted more than land or cattle. "Why me?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse. "You need a ranch, and she needs a husband. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement," Blackwood said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You have until sundown tomorrow to decide, but I suggest you consider what your father's legacy is worth to you." Ethan stumbled out of the bank, his mind reeling. The sun seemed even hotter, the air thicker. As he stood on the boardwalk, dazed, he saw her. Alara was leaving the mercantile, a small basket in her hand. She kept her head down, her bonnet hiding her face, but he could see the rigid set of her shoulders, as if bracing for the stares and the silence that followed her everywhere. A few matrons on the opposite side of the street stopped their chatter, their eyes following her with a mixture of pity and contempt. She was an outcast, sentenced by gossip and biology. In that moment, Ethan didn't see a deal or a solution. He saw his own prison taking a human form. To save his past, he would have to sacrifice his future to a woman destined to be as barren as the land that had brought him to his knees. The wedding day dawned under a sky the color of a bruised plum. A thin, melancholic drizzle slicked the dusty main street of Redemption, turning it into a muddy track that seemed to swallow the sound of every footstep. The church, usually a place of hope, felt more like a courtroom where a sentence was about to be passed. Ethan stood at the altar, his best-worn suit feeling stiff and foreign on his shoulders. The scent of damp wood and old hymns filled the air, thick and suffocating. He watched the townsfolk file in, not with joy, but with a morbid curiosity. Their faces were a gallery of pity and judgment. He saw Mrs. Gable whispering to her husband, her eyes flicking towards him with a look that could curdle milk. They weren't here to celebrate a union, they were here to witness a sacrifice. Then, the heavy oak doors creaked open. Silas Blackwood entered, a grim warden escorting his charge, and behind him was Alara. She wasn't in a traditional white gown, but a simple dress of pale blue cotton, clean but faded from countless washes. It was a dress for a day of chores, not for a wedding. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and her face was pale and serene, an island of calm in a sea of whispers. She held no flowers. As she walked down the aisle, her gaze was fixed forward, never once meeting the eyes of the gossiping onlookers. Ethan saw not weakness in her posture, but a quiet, stubborn dignity that defied their scorn. It was the dignity of someone long accustomed to being invisible. The preacher, a nervous man named Reverend Miller, rushed through the vows as if the words themselves were on fire. When Ethan was prompted to speak, his voice was a low rasp. "I do." The words felt like stones in his throat. When it was Alara's turn, her voice was surprisingly clear, a soft but steady murmur that cut through the silence. "I do." There was no exchange of rings. Blackwood had deemed it an unnecessary expense. With a final, mumbled blessing, it was over. Ethan Cole was a married man. As they stepped outside, the drizzle had stopped, but the air remained cold and heavy. Silas clapped Ethan on the shoulder, a gesture devoid of warmth. "The deed will be filed in your name by morning. The debt is cleared," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a gavel. "See that you honor the arrangement." He gave Alara a curt nod and walked away, leaving them alone amidst the dispersing crowd. "Ethan," a familiar voice called out. It was his friend, Jake, a fellow ranch hand with honest eyes and calloused hands. He strode over, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. What in blazes was that, marrying Blackwood's niece? The whole town's talking. "It's done, Jake. The ranch is safe," Ethan said, his tone flat. Jake's eyes fell on Alara, who stood a few feet away, her gaze fixed on the distant hills. "But at what cost, man? A life with her?" He lowered his voice, the town's cruel label hanging unspoken in the air. "You deserve a family, kids to carry on the Cole name." "I made my choice," Ethan clipped out, the words tasting like ash. He couldn't explain the crushing weight of his father's legacy, the feeling that the land itself was in his blood. He nodded to his friend and turned towards his wagon. "Come on," he said to Alara, the first word he had spoken directly to her all day. She followed without a word. The journey back to the ranch was a long stretch of strained silence, punctuated only by the clatter of wagon wheels and the lowing of distant cattle. They sat on opposite ends of the bench, a chasm of unspoken truths between them. When they arrived, Ethan gestured towards the small, weathered ranch house. "This is it." She slid off the wagon, her movements graceful and unhurried. She paused at the porch, her hand resting for a moment on one of the worn wooden posts his father had carved. Her eyes scanned the small home, taking it all in. That night, they ate a silent meal of bread and cold beef. Afterward, Ethan cleared his throat. "The room at the end of the hall is yours. It's small, but it's clean." Alara simply nodded. As she walked past the main room, her gaze caught on something in the shadows. A small, dusty rocking horse Ethan's father had made for the child he never had. For a fleeting second, her composure fractured. An unreadable emotion flickered in her eyes, a deep and ancient sorrow, before she masked it and disappeared into her room, closing the door softly behind her. Ethan stood alone, the silence of the house pressing in. The ranch was his, but his home had never felt so empty. The first week bled into the second with a monotonous, suffocating silence. Life at the ranch settled into a rigid routine, a silent dance of avoidance. Ethan rose before dawn, the chill of the morning air a familiar comfort. He'd find coffee already brewed on the stove, hot and black, but Alara would be nowhere in sight. He'd work until his muscles screamed, mending fences, tending to the cattle, losing himself in the physical labor that had always been his solace. He was pouring his bitterness and frustration into the very soil he'd sold his future to protect. Alara moved through the house like a ghost. She kept it impeccably clean, prepared meals that she left on the table for him, and spent her time tending to a small garden she'd started near the back porch. They were two planets in the same small orbit, held together by a contract but never touching. Ethan found himself watching her sometimes from a distance. He saw the way she carefully tended the new sprouts, her touch gentle, her focus absolute. It was the same quiet intensity she brought to every task. She never complained, never spoke unless absolutely necessary, and never met his gaze for more than a fleeting second. She was a closed book, and he felt no desire to read it. Then the sky turned against them. One afternoon, the air grew heavy and still, the oppressive humidity a prelude to violence. The sun vanished behind a bruised purple bank of clouds that rolled in from the west, swallowing the horizon. Ethan had seen storms like this before. They came on fast and hit with a fury that could tear a homestead apart. A sharp crack of lightning split the sky, followed by a roar of thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. He was already sprinting toward the pasture where the new calves were grazing with their mothers. Panic was setting in among the herd. The cattle were lowing nervously, their eyes wide as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. He had to get them into the barn, especially the vulnerable young ones. The wind kicked up, whipping his hat from his head and plastering his shirt to his back. Rain came down in blinding sheets, turning the dry earth into a slick, treacherous mud. He was struggling, one man against 100 panicked animals and a raging storm. A young calf, separated from its mother, slipped and went down in the mud, bawling pitifully. As Ethan fought his way toward it, another figure appeared at his side, seemingly from nowhere. It was Alara. Her hair was soaked and plastered to her face, her simple dress already caked in mud, but her eyes were clear and determined. She held a long, sturdy branch she must have torn from a fallen tree. Ethan stared, dumbfounded. "Get back inside. It's not safe," he yelled over the wind. She ignored him. Without a word, she moved to his left, using the branch to create a moving barrier, expertly turning a straying cow back toward the barn. Her movements weren't those of a seasoned ranch hand, but they were smart, economical, and utterly fearless. She didn't flinch at the thunder or the chaos. She simply saw what needed to be done. Together, they became a team born of necessity. They communicated with shouts and gestures, a raw and primal language understood over the storm's howl. They guided the herd, section by section, toward the safety of the barn. When they reached the fallen calf, Ethan knelt to lift it, its small body heavy and slick. He slipped, his boots finding no purchase. Before he could fall, Alara was there, her hands grabbing his arm to steady him, her surprising strength a jolt through his system. Together, they hoisted the calf and carried it into the barn. Once the last animal was secured and the heavy barn door was bolted against the storm, they stood in the relative quiet, dripping and gasping for breath. The scent of wet hay, animals, and rain filled the air. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a different kind of silence fell between them. It wasn't empty or awkward anymore. It was filled with the weight of their shared struggle. "Thanks," Ethan managed to say, his voice rough with exhaustion. Alara just nodded, pushing a wet strand of hair from her eyes. For the first time, she held his gaze. In their depths, he didn't see the fragile, pitied woman from the wedding. He saw a flicker of steel, a resilience that matched the unyielding landscape around them. He had married a stranger to save his land, but he was beginning to suspect he didn't know this woman at all. The morning after the storm broke clear and sharp, the Texas sky scrubbed clean of clouds. But on the ground, chaos reigned. The churning mud was littered with splintered fence posts, overturned troughs, and debris washed down from the low hills. It was a picture of nature's raw, indifferent power. Ethan surveyed the damage from the porch, a mug of coffee steaming in his hands, the warmth doing little to soothe the knot in his stomach. The repairs would take days, maybe weeks. He heard the soft creak of the screen door and turned to see Alara emerge, dressed in practical denim trousers and a simple cotton shirt, her hair tightly braided. She held a pair of worn leather gloves. She didn't speak, merely met his gaze with a questioning look, her eyes scanning the wrecked fence line that bordered the south pasture. There was no hesitation in her posture, only a quiet readiness. "The south fence is the priority," Ethan said, his voice raspy in the morning air. "Coyotes will be sniffing around if we don't get it secured by nightfall." She simply nodded, pulling on her gloves. For hours, they worked under the unforgiving sun, the silence between them no longer heavy and oppressive, but filled with the rhythmic sounds of their labor. The thud of the post driver, the squeak of wire being stretched taut, the shared grunts of effort. Ethan found himself watching her. She worked with an efficient, focused grace, anticipating his next move, handing him a staple before he had to ask, holding a post steady without being told. There was a competence in her hands that belied the town's image of a delicate, useless woman. The sun was high in the sky when Ethan paused, wiping a sleeve across his sweat-slicked brow. "I've been around ranches my whole life," he began, his voice casual, though the question had been brewing for hours. "I've never seen anyone face down a charging bull with a piece of canvas and not even flinch. Where did you learn that?" Alara stopped coiling a length of wire, her back still to him. For a moment, he thought she would ignore him, retreating back into her shell. When she finally turned, her expression was unreadable, her gray eyes guarded. "My father believed idleness was a sin," she said, her voice low and even. "He taught me that the world doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It only cares if you can stand on your own 2 feet. She offered no more, no mention of where or when. The answer was a wall, not a door. Before Ethan could press further, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. A lone rider was approaching from the main road. Ethan recognized the familiar gait of Jake's roan mare. His friend, his best man, and the biggest gossip in Redemption. A flicker of something annoyance, maybe protectiveness, went through Ethan. He instinctively took a step, positioning himself slightly in front of Alara. He saw Jake rein in his horse, his eyes wide with unconcealed surprise as he took in the scene. The two of them, covered in dirt and sweat, working side by side like a long-married couple. "Ethan, heard the storm hit you folks hard," Jake called out, dismounting. His gaze shifted from the broken fence to Alara, a curious, almost pitying look on his face. "Didn't figure, well, good to see you've got some help, I suppose." The implication was clear. He was surprised to see Alara doing actual work. The old anger coiled in Ethan's gut, but before he could say something he'd regret, Alara stepped forward. "The storm didn't ask for permission, Jake," she said, her voice calm and steady, betraying no offense. "The work has to be done." She met his stare without flinching, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to his clumsy intrusion. Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Right, of course. We're managing," Ethan said, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. He rested a hand on a fence post near Alara's shoulder, a small, unconscious gesture of solidarity. "But thanks for checking in." The visit was short. Jake, sensing the unfamiliar and united front, quickly made his excuses and rode off, no doubt with a new story to tell in town. As his dust settled, Ethan and Alara were left in the quiet aftermath. They hadn't exchanged a word of strategy, yet they had acted as one. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not the banker's niece or the town's pariah, but a woman of hidden steel. The wall around her was still there, but for the first time, he felt like they were standing on the same side of it. Jake's visit left a crack in the silence that had defined their lives. In the days that followed, the quiet on the ranch was no longer a sign of distance, but of a shared, unspoken understanding. Ethan found himself watching Alara, not with suspicion, but with a burgeoning curiosity. He noticed the efficient way she mended a tear in his work shirt, her stitches small and perfect. He saw the gentle way she treated the horses, murmuring to them in a low voice that held a warmth he'd never heard her use with him. The ranch was their sanctuary, a world sealed off from redemption's prying eyes. But they both knew it couldn't last. The news came, as it always did, on the wind. A neighboring rancher, stopping by for a cup of water on his way to town, mentioned the talk swirling around the general store. "Folks are sayin' you two are mackin' a real go of it," he'd said, a surprised but not unkind look in his eyes. "Jake's been tellin' everyone how you handled that storm damage. Like a proper team." Ethan saw the subtle stiffening of Alara's shoulders. The town's gaze was turning towards them again, not with pity this time, but with a different, more intrusive interest. Their peace was about to be tested. The inevitable arrived a day later when Alara quietly announced they were nearly out of flour and coffee. The storm repairs had also depleted their supply of fence nails. A trip into redemption was unavoidable. The ride into town was tense. The familiar dirt road, usually a path of solitary work, now felt like a stage leading to a public trial. Ethan cleared his throat, the sound loud in the morning air. "People might stare," he said, not looking at her. "They'll be talkin'." Alara's gloved hands tightened on the reins of her mare. "People are always talking, Ethan," she replied, her voice steady. "It's their favorite pastime." Her calmness was a strange sort of armor, and Ethan felt a flicker of admiration. She wasn't afraid, she was merely prepared. As they rode down Main Street, the whispers started like the rustling of dry leaves. Heads turned. Windows of the saloon and the dressmaker's shop suddenly had faces pressed against them. It was exactly as Ethan had predicted, yet seeing it felt different. He wasn't just a cowboy shackled to the town pariah. He was riding beside his wife, and an unfamiliar wave of protectiveness washed over him. He instinctively moved his horse a little closer to hers. Inside the general store, the air grew thick with unspoken questions. Mrs. Gable, a woman whose tongue was sharper than her sewing needles, stood by the fabric bolts, her eyes narrowed. She waited until Alara was counting out coins for the flour before she made her move. Well, Alara," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It's a surprise to see you looking so put together. I suppose a husband, any husband, is better than none at all." The insult was aimed squarely at both of them, a jab at Alara's reputation and Ethan's forced marriage. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he took a step forward, ready to defend her. But before he could speak, Alara turned slowly. She looked Mrs. Gable directly in the eye, her expression unreadable. "Some women find their worth in a husband, Mrs. Gable," she said, her voice quiet but carrying through the silent store. "I prefer to find mine in my work. It's far more reliable." She then turned back to the counter, handed over her coins, and took the heavy sack of flour as if the conversation had never happened. A stunned silence fell over the store. Mrs. Gable's face flushed a deep, mottled red. She was left standing speechless, utterly disarmed by Alara's calm, sharp dignity. Ethan stared, completely taken aback. He had expected tears or a retreat into silence, but instead, she had met cruelty with a strength that was as sharp and clean as a knife's edge. He gathered the nails and coffee without a word, his mind reeling. As they walked out, he held the door for her. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and in that moment, he saw a flicker of something new, not just resilience, but a defiant pride. The bond forged in the storm and solidified against Jake's judgment had just been tempered in the fires of public scorn. They were no longer just two individuals forced together. They were a partnership. A fragile peace had settled over the ranch in the days following their trip to redemption. The air, once thick with unspoken resentment, now held a comfortable quiet. They worked in a rhythm born of shared purpose. Ethan mending a fence while Alara tended her burgeoning garden. Her hands, once pale and hesitant, now dusted with the rich soil. He found himself watching her more often, not with the suspicion of a jailer, but with a quiet curiosity. He saw the way her shoulders relaxed when she thought he wasn't looking, the hint of a smile that touched her lips when a new sprout pushed through the earth. One afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the yard, the sound of an approaching carriage shattered the tranquility. It wasn't the familiar clatter of a farm wagon. This was the polished, heavy roll of wealth and power. Ethan straightened up, his hand instinctively going to the handle of the axe he'd been using to split wood. Alara rose from her garden, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a mask of sudden tension. The carriage that pulled up before their home was stark black, gleaming under the afternoon sun, pulled by two perfectly matched horses. The man who stepped out was just as severe, Silas Blackwood. He surveyed the modest ranch with a look of undisguised disdain, his eyes lingering for a moment on Alara's dirty apron. "Well, well," he said, his voice a low sneer that carried easily in the still air. "It seems domesticity suits you, niece. I'd almost forgotten you were capable of useful work." Alara flinched as if struck, but Ethan stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her. It was an unconscious, protective gesture that did not go unnoticed by Blackwood. "What do you want, Blackwood?" Ethan's voice was cold, devoid of the deference he'd shown in the banker's office. Blackwood's thin lips twisted into a smirk. "Merely checking on my investment. I hear tales from town. It seems my shy, barren niece has found her voice, causing quite a stir, I understand." He looked directly at Alara, his gaze sharp and cruel. "I trust you remember our arrangement. You are to be a quiet, dutiful wife, not the town spectacle." The word barren hung in the air, a deliberate poison. Ethan saw Alara's hands clench into fists at her sides, her knuckles white. He felt a surge of fury he hadn't known he was capable of. "She's my wife," Ethan said, his voice low and steady, a dangerous rumble beneath the surface. "How she acts is my business, not yours. You got what you wanted, now leave us be." Blackwood laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "Oh, my boy, you misunderstand the nature of our transaction. I still hold the deed to this pathetic plot of land. Your freedom and hers," he gestured dismissively at Alara, "is conditional. It depends entirely on my satisfaction." He took a step closer, his focus entirely on Alara now. "I hope you haven't been filling this simple cowboy's head with any of your fanciful stories, my dear. We both know the truth of your condition, don't we?" That was it. That was the moment Ethan saw the true terror behind Alara's carefully constructed walls. Her face went pale, a flicker of a memory so raw and painful it was almost visible passed through her eyes. Her breath hitched. Whatever Blackwood was referring to, it was a wound far deeper than town gossip. Seeing her fear ignite his protective instinct into a blaze. "Get off my land," Ethan ordered, taking a menacing step forward. The axe was still in his hand, held loosely at his side, but its presence was a clear threat. For the first time, a flicker of surprise crossed Blackwood's face. He looked from Ethan's resolute expression to Alara's shaken form and back again. The united front was not what he had expected. "Very well," Blackwood said smoothly, retreating a step toward his carriage. "Have it your way. But remember, Ethan, every fence post, every blade of grass you stand on, you owe to me. And debts always come due." With a final, venomous glare at Alara, he climbed back into his carriage and was gone, leaving a cloud of dust and suffocating silence in his wake. The tension did not leave with him. It coiled between Ethan and Alara, thick and heavy. He turned to her. She was trembling, her eyes fixed on the empty road where her uncle had disappeared, seeing something else entirely. She looked utterly broken. "Alara," Ethan said, his voice softer now. What did he mean? What truth was he talking about? She finally looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not just strength or sadness, but a story of profound betrayal shimmering in her tear-filled eyes. The walls had finally crumbled. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls as Alara finally broke her silence. Her voice, barely a whisper, was laced with the agony of a wound that had never healed. "He lied, Ethan. He lied about everything." Ethan remained still, his expression unreadable but his presence a solid anchor in her storm. He simply waited, giving her the space she had never been afforded. "I was never infertile," she confessed, the words tearing from her throat. "Years ago, before I came to live with him, I fell in love. He was a good man, a stable hand, not the sort of match my uncle approved of for his business ambitions." Her gaze drifted to a dark corner of the room, as if seeing a ghost. "We were young, I became pregnant. I was so happy and so terrified." The story spilled out, a clandestine relationship, a secret birth aided by a midwife sworn to silence, and the beautiful, fleeting moments she held her baby boy. Then came the darkness. "Silas found out," she choked out, a sob catching in her breath. "He said it would bring ruin and scandal to his name. He said no one would ever want me. One night, he just took him. He told me my son was sent away to a good family, far from here, where the shame couldn't follow. He created the story of my barrenness to control me, to make me a pitiable pawn he could marry off to settle a debt." Ethan's jaw tightened, a cold fury rising in his chest that burned hotter than any desert sun. He looked at Alara, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a burden or a mystery, but as a mother whose child had been stolen from her. The hidden cradle in the barn was not a symbol of emptiness, but a shrine of hope, a desperate, silent promise to a son she'd never known. He crossed the room and knelt before her, taking her trembling hands in his. "He won't control you anymore," Ethan said, his voice low and firm. "He won't control us." The next morning, they rode into redemption not as a mismatched couple, but as a unified force. The townsfolk who had once whispered behind their hands now stared in silence at the fierce determination on their faces. They didn't stop at the general store or the saloon. They marched directly to the Redemption Bank and Trust, the door slamming open against the wall. Silas Blackwood looked up from his ledger, his face a mask of irritation that quickly curdled into apprehension. "What is the meaning of this?" he blustered. "Your lies are over, Silas," Ethan stated, his voice ringing with authority. He stood beside Alara, a protective wall of solid muscle and unwavering resolve. It was Alara, however, who stepped forward. Her voice, once timid, was now clear and sharp as glass. "You took my son from me," she declared, her words cutting through the tense silence of the bank. The clerk froze, his pen hovering over a document. "You will tell me where he is." "Now." Blackwood paled, his eyes darting toward the other patrons. This was the one thing he feared most: public scandal. "This is a private family matter," he hissed. "It stopped being private when you used her as currency to save my ranch," Ethan countered. "Tell her, or I swear I will ride to every town from here to St. Louis and tell every one of your business partners what kind of monster you truly are. Your reputation will be ashes." The threat hit its mark. Cornered and defeated, the banker's arrogance finally shattered. With a trembling hand, he pulled the deed to the Cole Ranch from a drawer and shoved it across the desk. Then, he scribbled a name on a piece of paper, an orphanage, 2 states away. "Take it," he spat, his empire of deceit crumbling around him. "And get out." Back at the ranch, the setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air felt lighter, cleaner. Ethan and Alara stood on the porch, the deed to their land held firmly between them. It was finally, truly theirs. Later that evening, Ethan walked to the barn and returned with the small, dusty cradle. He didn't hide it away. He placed it by the hearth in the main room, where the firelight warmed the worn wood. It was no longer a secret filled with sorrow, but a beacon of their future. "We'll go together," Ethan said softly, his hand finding hers. Alara looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, not of grief, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude. "We'll bring him home," she whispered. Their journey had just begun.